The stagecoach shuddered to a final stop amid a swirling veil of ochre dust that stung like accusations long buried. Lydia gripped the splintered doorframe, her broad shoulders hunched against the sudden exposure, heart hammering so fiercely she feared it might crack the fragile shell of resolve she had carried across 1,000 dusty miles. This was it, the end of the line, the moment her own blood had forced upon her. Her sister's parting words still echoed, cold and final. "You read too much, Lydia. Too big, too scarred, too broken for any decent life here. Best you go where no one knows." Betrayed by the very hands that should have held her, she had become mail-order freight, shipped west to a man she had never seen. The scar across her low-epte cheek pulled tight as the afternoon suns glared down, a jagged pink line from the wagon wreck that had widowed her and left her marked in the eyes of everyone who once claimed to love her. Now, stepping down onto the hard-packed earth of Willow Creek, her boots sank slightly into the warm grit, and the weight of her full figure, soft, rounded belly, wide hips that had never fit any fashionable mold, made the ground feel even less forgiving. Cruel whispers rose immediately from the knot of townsfolk clustered near the depot, their voices sharp as the wind off the distant mountains. "Lord, look at the size of her," one woman sneered, fan fluttering like a weapon. "No wonder they sent her out here. Ain't it no room back east for a widow built like a barn?" Laughter rippled, low and mocking, and Lydia's cheeks burned hotter than the sun-baked planks beneath her. She smoothed her high-necked calico blouse with trembling fingers, the faded blue fabric stretching across her bosom and arms in a way that only invited more glances. Yet in that first crushing moment, something steadier stirred beneath the shame. She lifted her chin a fraction, the subtle behavior born of years, learning to stand when every instinct begged her to vanish. The air carried the sharp scent of sun-warmed pine resin from the distant ridges mixed with the earthy musk of horses and the faint, metallic tang of the nearby blacksmith's forge. A sensory moment that grounded her even as her stomach twisted. This frontier smelled alive, raw, and unforgiving, much like the life she had been handed. If this slow unfolding tale of quiet courage and second chances touches something deep inside you, perhaps pause here a moment. Like the video if the warmth reaches you. Subscribe so these fireside stories can keep finding hearts that need them. And leave a gentle comment below, sharing what you feel about Lydia's very first step into the unknown. Gideon's letter had been brief, almost curt, promising only a roof and honest work. She had answered it with the last of her savings, and the quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, a giant of a man on a remote ranch would see past the scar and the sighs that had made her own kin turn away. Now, standing alone beside her single carpetbag, she wondered if even that small hope had been a cruel joke. Memories flooded her in quiet waves. Her brother's averted eyes as he counted the coins her departure would save the family farm. Her mother's whispered sigh of relief that at least she wasn't to be a burden anymore. Betrayed by blood. The phrase sat heavy in her chest like an unhealed bruise. How could the people who shared her name have looked at her rounded form, at the mark fate had carved across her face, and decided she was better sent away than sheltered? A small warmth beat flickered then, unexpected and gentle. The stage driver, an older man with sun-leathered hands, lingered a second longer than necessary. Without a word he lifted her bag and set it nearer her feet, offering the faintest nod of respect before climbing back up. It was nothing grand, just a small courtesy, yet it eased the knot in her throat for a breath. Another warmth followed when a barefoot boy of perhaps 6, who had been watching from the depot steps, dropped his wooden top and watched it roll toward her. Lydia bent, her thick thighs protesting the motion, and rolled it back to him with careful fingers. The boy's eyes widened, and for a heartbeat a shy smile broke across his dusty face before he scampered off. She felt the third quiet warmth bloom inside her own heart, a reminder that kindness could still be given, even when none was offered in return. The townsfolk's mockery continued in low murmurs, but Lydia kept her gaze fixed on the distant purple mountains, willing her breathing to slow. Short sentences of tension ran through her mind. Stand tall. Do not shrink. This is not the end. Long, healing thoughts came next, unspooling like the slow campfire tales she had once heard as a girl. Stories of women who carved new lives from hardship. She reflected quietly on the journey that had brought her here, the endless days of rattling wheels, and sleepless nights wondering if any man could truly want a big-sized widow whose own family had seen her as excess weight. Yet here she stood, fragile in spirit if not in frame, carrying a heart of gold that refused to tarnish completely. Dust devils swirled lazily across the street, and the sun dipped a fraction, painting the wooden storefronts in softer gold. Gideon's ranch lay somewhere beyond the horizon she knew, a place of open sky and silent labor, where 2 young children waited for a mother figure they had never asked for. The thought stirred reluctant motherhood in her chest, a flicker she tried to ignore. For now, the depot felt like enemy territory, every sneer, a fresh wound atop the old scar. Still, she did not run. Then, far down the rutted main street, a figure appeared on horseback. A silhouette so massive, it seemed to dwarf the buildings around it. The rider sat tall and broad, shoulders wide as a barn door, the horse itself looking almost small beneath him. Lydia's breath caught. Could that be him? The giant cowboy her letter had described in such sparse words? Hope and terror braided together in her chest, an open loop of possibility that left her pulse racing once more. The crowd's whispers quieted for a heartbeat as the rider drew nearer, his presence cutting through the hostility like a quiet blade. But before she could take a single step toward him, the stage driver's voice murmured low behind her. "Ma'am, best you know. Folks here don't take kindly to outsiders who don't fit the mold. You sure this is the life you want?" His words hung unresolved in the warm air, a sudden revelation that made her question everything anew. The massive rider was close enough, now that she could see the glint of sunlight on his dark beard, yet the distance between them still felt like miles of doubt. What if even this towering stranger took one look at Mott, her full figure and scarred cheek, and turned away like all the rest? The thought lingered, heavy and unanswered, as the dust settled around her boots, and the first real test of her new life loomed just beyond reach. The thought lingered, heavy and unanswered, as the dust settled around her boots, and the first real test of her new life loomed just beyond reach. The rider's horse snorted softly, hooves clopping with deliberate weight on the hard-packed street, and the townsfolk seized the moment like wolves sensing weakness. Their voices rose in a cruel chorus that cut through the afternoon heat, each word honed to wound. "Would you look at her?" One barrel-chested man sneered from the depot steps, his belly shaking with laughter. "Mail-order bride? More like mail-order barn. Bet the poor fellow who sent for her thought he was getting a wife, not a side of beef." Whispers rippled outward, laced with mocking delight. A woman in a faded bonnet leaned toward her companion and murmured, "That scar on her cheek. Looks like she tangled with a grizzly and lost. No wonder her own kin shipped her off. Who'd want a big broken thing like that warming their bed?" Lydia stood rooted, the ground beneath her boots radiating the day's stored warmth through the thin soles, a specific sensory moment that anchored her even as shame threatened to buckle her knees. The air thickened with the sharp tang of horse sweat, oiled leather, and the faint, sweet decay of hay bales stacked nearby, all mingling in a way that made the mockery feel even more suffocating. She wanted to shrink, to fold her full figure into something smaller, less noticeable. Yet a subtle character behavior held her steady. Her thick fingers brushed once across the jagged scar on her left cheek in an old, unconscious gesture of protection, then dropped firmly to her side, as if refusing to give the crowd the satisfaction of seeing her hide. Short sentences of tension flashed through her mind. "Stand. Breathe. Do not break." The long, healing sentences followed slower, unspooling like the quiet campfire tales of women who had endured worse and still found dawn. In that quiet emotional reflection, she saw it clearly. This public spectacle was no accident, but a cruel joke turned destiny. The very rejection that had chased her west now testing whether her heart of gold could outlast the laughter. Her own blood had cast her aside for these very reasons. Too big, too scarred, too much, and here, the frontier echoed the same verdict louder than ever. Yet something stubborn flickered beneath it all, a resolve that refused to let the jeers define the woman she still hoped to become. 3 small warmth beats slipped in amid the storm, gentle as embers in the dark. First, the barefoot boy from earlier darted back through the crowd, pressed a single wilted bluebonnet into her palm without a word, then vanished again. His shy kindness, a tiny shield against the cruelty. Second, an elderly storekeeper paused in the doorway of his shop, his weathered face softening for the briefest instant as he caught her eye. He gave the faintest nod before turning away, a silent acknowledgement that not every soul in Willow Creek reveled in the sport. Third, a thin yellow dog with a crooked tail wandered from under a wagon, leaned its warm weight against her wide hip for a long moment, and let out a contented sigh before trotting on, as if claiming her for its own, in that simple, wordless way animals sometimes do. The rider had drawn almost level now, his towering silhouette cutting a path through the hostility, yet the jests did not falter. "Heard the man's name is Gideon," another voice sneered from the edge of the group. "Big as a mountain himself, but even he'll see she's no prize, once he gets a proper look. Probably regrets that letter already." Laughter swelled again, sharper this time, and Lydia felt the heat rise in her cheeks, the scar pulling tight under the weight of every stare. Gideon, if that was indeed him, sat motionless in the saddle for a heartbeat. His massive frame a silent wall that made the nearest mockers shift uncomfortably. He did not speak, did not raise a hand. His presence alone pressed the air heavier, authoritative without effort, the stoic giant whose short, powerful aura seemed to rebuke the noise without a single word. Still, the open loop of uncertainty twisted tighter in Lydia's chest. What if this was all the welcome she would ever receive? What if the giant cowboy now, approaching, had pictured someone delicate and unmarked, not a big-sized widow whose own family had seen her as excess baggage? The horse stamped once, leather creaking under Gideon's weight, and the sensory moment deepened. The faint, metallic scent of the bit mixing vacapite hot warm, animal hide, and the dry prairie wind that carried away some of the crowd's words, but none of their sting. She reflected again. Longer this time, on the reluctant path that had brought her here, wondering if reluctant motherhood and a chance at homemaking could ever bloom in soil this hostile. Yet the 3 warmth beats lingered like quiet promises. The boy's flower still rested in her hand, its petals soft against her calloused palm. The storekeeper's nod echoed in her memory. The dog's brief lean had left a trace of comfort along her side. Small things, yes, but they pete her feet planted when every instinct whispered to flee back onto the stagecoach and disappear. Gideon's horse took another step closer, close enough now that she could see the weathered tan of his hands on the reins, the breadth of his shoulders blocking the sun for her. He dismounted with surprising grace, for a man so immense, boots hitting the dirt with a solid thud that silenced the nearest sneers mid-breath. The crowd parted slightly, their mockery fading into uneasy murmurs, but one final voice carried on the breeze, whispered low enough that only Lydia and the approaching giant might hear. "Mark my words, she'll be gone by month's end. No man keeps a joke like that around his young ones." The words hung unresolved in the warm air, a sudden revelation that struck deeper than the rest, reopening the old wound of her betrayal by blood, and planting fresh doubt about the children she had not yet met. Gideon stood now at her side, his towering frame an anchor she had not expected, yet the question burned brighter than ever. What if the cruel jests proved true, and even this silent protectoress home offered no real shelter after all? The flower in her fingers trembled slightly, as the dust swirled once more around them both, leaving the fragile widow caught between mockery and the unknown promise of the giant cowboy's shadowed gaze. The flower in her fingers trembled slightly as the dust swirled once more around them both, leaving the fragile widow caught between mockery and the unknown promise of the giant cowboy's shadowed gaze. Gideon stood fully before her now, his boots planted wide in the dirt, and the crowd's cruel laughter died as if a heavy blanket had been thrown over the entire depot square. He did not shout. He did not gesture. His towering frame, 6 feet 9 inches of solid, unyielding presence, simply existed there like the distant mountains themselves, shoulders broad enough to block the sun and cast a cool shadow across Lydia's hunched form. The stoic giant's deep-set blue eyes swept once over the knot of townsfolk, a single authoritative glance that made even the loudest sneerer shift backward a step, boots scraping in sudden unease. The air around him carried a specific sensory moment that wrapped around her like an unexpected embrace. Warm leather from the saddle, faint pine resin from the high country trails he had ridden, and the clean, earthy scent of honest sweat, earned through long days of ranch labor. It was not overpowering, only steady and real, grounding her racing heart in a way no words could. Lydia looked up, way up, her hazel eyes widening in quiet awe at the sheer scale of him, and a subtle character behavior slipped out before she could stop it. Her thick fingers tightened around the wilted bluebonnet, then released as one hand rose instinctively to brush a stray lock of hair from her scarred cheek, not in shame this time, but in a small unconscious bid to meet his gaze more openly. For the first time in years, tentative safety bloomed in her chest, fragile as morning frost yet undeniably there, pushing back against the lingering jeers that still echoed in her mind. In that quiet emotional reflection, she saw the shape of seeking work laid bare before her. This giant cowboy had not come for romance or beauty. His letter had spoken only of honest labor, a roof that needed tending, and 2 small children who required steady hands. She was here as hired help in the guise of a bride, a practical arrangement born of necessity rather than desire, yet his silent arrival felt like the first thread of something deeper. Short sentences of tension flickered through her thoughts. Stand tall. He sees you. Do not flinch. Then longer, healing sentences followed, slow and warming like the campfire tales of old. Perhaps this towering man, who had ridden through the hostility without a word of his own, offered the very work her betrayed heart had been seeking, a place where her size and her scar might finally become assets instead of curses. 3 small warmth beats unfolded in the space between them, gentle and unhurried. First, Gideon reached down without ceremony and lifted her carpetbag in one massive hand, as though it weighed nothing at all, his calloused fingers brushing hers for the briefest instant in a touch that steadied rather than startled. Second, a young ranch hand who had trailed behind on a second horse murmured low to the crowd, "Best clear the way. Gideon take kindly to loose talk," and the words carried just enough respect to make 2 women in the front row lower their fans and step aside. Third, the thin yellow dog from earlier reappeared at Lydia's side, pressing its warm flank against her wide hip once more, but this time it stayed, tail thumping softly as if declaring allegiance to the new arrival and the quiet giant who had claimed her. The townsfolk muttered still, their voices now reduced to uneasy whispers, but Gideon's presence had carved a clear path through their cruelty. He gave a single short nod toward the waiting horses, his stoic face revealing nothing, yet conveying everything needed. She was his to take home. Lydia followed, her full figure, moving with a new steadiness under the shelter of his shadow, the scar on her cheek no longer burning quite so hot under the weight of his quiet acceptance. He helped her mount the smaller horse with effortless strength, one large hand at her elbow guiding her up until she sat securely in the saddle, petticoats settling around her thick thighs. The leather creaked softly beneath her, and the horse shifted, sensing her unfamiliar weight, yet holding steady, under the giant cowboy's watchful eye. They rode out of Willow Creek side by side, the town's mocking eyes following them, until the last building faded into the rolling prairie. Gideon spoke not a word, yet his silence felt protective rather than cold, the rhythmic thud of hooves and the distant call of a hawk the only sounds accompanying them. Lydia's quiet reflection deepened with exa hot mile. This was the work she had crossed the country for, seeking not duate survival, but a chance to prove her heart of gold in a place where no one knew her past betrayals. The children waited at the remote ranch. She knew, 2 young souls who had lost their mother and now faced a big-sized widow stepping into their world. Reluctant motherhood stirred again in her chest, a cautious warmth she dared not name aloud. The prairie opened wide before them, golden grass, bending in the late afternoon breeze, and the mountains loomed larger, their purple ridges promising both shelter and challenge. Gideon's horse stayed close, his massive frame a constant anchor at her side, and she caught herself glancing sideways at him more than once, awe mixing with the tentative safety that had taken root back at the depot. A small warmth beat lingered in the simple fact that he had not hurried her, had not spoken down to her, had simply claimed her presence as part of his day's honest labor. Yet an open loop of uncertainty twisted gently in the background. What would those children see when they first laid eyes on her rounded form and marked face? Would the giant cowboy's silent protection extend all the way to the ranch door, or would the cruel jokes of the town follow them home, like stubborn dust on their boots? The sun dipped lower, painting the trail in long golden strokes, and Gideon reined in briefly at a small rise to let the horses drink from a clear stream. He dismounted, then turned to offer her his hand, broad, steady, scarred from years of rope and ranch work. Lydia accepted it, her own fingers disappearing into his grip for a heartbeat, and the contact sent a quiet ripple of reassurance through her. As they resumed the ride, the ranch buildings finally appeared on the horizon, low and sturdy against the sky, smoke curling from the chimney in a thin gray ribbon. Gideon's gaze remained forward, stoic and unreadable, but his shoulders relaxed a fraction, the subtle shift telling her they had crossed some invisible line into his domain. Still, the question of true belonging hung unresolved in the cooling air. The children's faces flickered in her imagination, small, watchful, possibly wary, and she wondered if her seeking work would be enough to earn their trust, or if the giant cowboy's home would reveal its own hidden tests. The flower she had tucked into her apron pocket earlier brushed against her palm with each step of the horse, a fragile reminder of the small kindness that had carried her this far. Yet as the ranch gate drew nearer, a sudden revelation pierced the quiet peace. One of the children stood visible on the porch now, a small boy no older than 8, staring toward them with wide eyes that held not just curiosity, but the shadow of something deeper, perhaps fear of yet another stranger who might leave like the last. Gideon's jaw tightened ever so slightly at the sight, his stoic mask cracking for the merest instant, and Lydia's heart clenched with the unresolved tension of what those young eyes might demand of her fragile new beginning. The horse's hooves crunched on the gravel as they approached the porch where the small boy stood, his wide eyes fixed on the newcomers with a mix of caution and quiet hope that made Lydia's chest tighten further. Gideon swung down first, his massive frame landing with a solid thud that sent a faint vibration through the wooden steps. He turned without a word and offered her his hand again, the same broad, steady grip from the trail now helping her dismount. Her boots met the packed earth in front of the low, sturdy ranch house, and a specific sensory moment wrapped around her like a worn quilt. The rich, earthy aroma of wood smoke curling from the chimney mingled with the savory scent of simmering stew from an open window, carrying hints of wild onions and slow-cooked venison that spoke of simple, honest meals prepared in silence. It was a smell of home, or at least the promise of one, yet it only deepened the ache of uncertainty blooming inside her. A subtle character behavior slipped from her then, unbidden and gentle. Lydia's thick fingers moved to the apron she had not yet removed from her travel clothes, smoothing the faded fabric over her rounded belly in a small protective gesture, as if to present herself a little more neatly to the watching eyes. The boy on the porch, Elias, she would learn soon enough, 8 years old and sturdy like his father, shifted his weight but did not run inside. From the doorway behind him peeked a smaller girl, no more than 6, with wide blue eyes and a braid of dark hair slipping over one shoulder. Clara. The children stood together, a silent pair shaped by loss, and Lydia felt the stirrings of reluctant motherhood tug at her heart like an unfamiliar rope. Gideon tied the horses to the hitching post with efficient motions, his stoic face revealing nothing, then turned to her. "The arrangement is set," he murmured, voice low and authoritative, carrying the weight of finality without raising in volume. "Mainly for them." He nodded once toward the children, the short, powerful words hanging in the cooling evening air like a fact rather than a welcome. No flowery promises, no softening of edges, just the plain truth of why a giant cowboy on a remote ranch had sent for a big-sized widow scarred by life. Lydia sensed the heavy walls around his heart in that moment, thick as the mountain stone that framed the ranch, built from his own unspoken grief, and the need to shield these young ones from further emptiness. She wondered, in the quiet spaces between his sparse words, if she could ever belong here. Not as a true wife, perhaps, but as something steady and useful. The pillar of reluctant motherhood pressed heavier now, a slow burn ache that mixed fear with a fragile, unexpected warmth. 3 small warmth beats unfolded like sparks rising from a low campfire. First, Elias stepped down from the porch on bare feet, hesitated, then offered her a single smooth river stone he had been clutching in his small fist, pressing it into her palm without meeting her eyes. It was warm from his grip, a tiny token of tentative trust. Second, Clara slipped fully into view and murmured softly, "Pa said you'd come," her voice carrying a child's simple acceptance that eased some of the tension in Lydia's shoulders. Third, Gideon himself moved to the side of the house and returned with a clean cloth from the wash line, handing it with a brief, wordless gesture toward the dust on her boots and skirt hem, a quiet act of care that spoke louder than any declaration. They moved inside together, the wooden door creaking open to reveal a sparse but cared-for cabin, a main room with a stone hearth, a rough-hewn table, and 2 small beds tucked in the corner for the children. The stew bubbled gently on the stove, filling the space with that same comforting aroma, and Lydia's quiet emotional reflection deepened as she stood there. Short sentences of tension ran through her mind. Fit in. Do not fail them. Walls too high. Then longer, healing sentences followed, unspooling slowly like the seasoned storyteller's tale around a dying fire. Perhaps reluctant motherhood was not about replacing what was lost, but about offering what she still carried. A heart of gold, scarred yet resilient, hands willing to mend and nurture in a home that had known too much silence. She had crossed the country seeking work, yet here, in the presence of these guarded little ones and their towering father, she felt the first real pull of something maternal, cautious and unforced, like a seed finding soil after long drought. Gideon's walls remained, she sensed, his grief for the wife gone too soon, kika ipete close and private, but the children's wary presence made her wonder if she might chip away at them, one careful day at a time. Gideon served the stew himself, ladling generous portions into tin bowls with those massive hands that could gentle a spooked horse or split logs in a single swing. They ate in, near silence at the table, the clink of spoons, the only sound breaking the evening quiet. Elias watched her over the rim of his bowl, curiosity slowly softening the edges of his caution. Clara leaned closer once, her small shoulder brushing Lydia's wide arm in an accidental touch that lingered a heartbeat longer than necessary. The giant cowboy ate methodically, his stoic gaze flicking occasionally to the children rather than to her. Yet his presence filled the room, like the mountains filled the horizon outside. Lydia felt the slow burn of possibility here, the reluctant union, not born of passion but of necessity and quiet honor. She belonged, if only as the practical answer to their needs, and that knowledge both steadied and unsettled her. As the meal ended and the children were sent to wash up, Gideon rose and stood by the hearth, his broad back to her, for a moment. "They need steadiness," he murmured, the words gruff yet laced with the depth of a father's love. "That's why you here." It was agreement, plain and unadorned, confirming the arrangement once more in the firelight. Lydia nodded, her hazel eyes tracing the lines of his shoulders, sensing again the heavy walls he kept raised high. She wondered if her Obese kept scars and sighs would ever feel small enough to slip past them, or if she would remain forever the mail-order solution rather than the chosen one. The fire crackled softly, casting long shadows that danced across the cabin walls, and a gentle peace settled for the first time since her arrival. Yet as night deepened and the children climbed into their beds, Clara's small voice carried from the corner whispered in the dark. "You want to leave like Ma, will you?" The question hung unresolved in the warm cabin air, a sudden revelation that pierced straight through Lydia's reluctant heart and left her breath catching. Gideon's jaw tightened visibly across the room, his stoic mask holding firm, but the open loop of doubt twisted tighter than ever. What if her presence here, meant to heal, only reminded them all of what had already been lost, and the fragile widow found herself unable to bridge the final distance to true belonging after all? The open loop of doubt twisted tighter than ever. What if her presence here, meant to heal, only reminded them all of what had already been lost, and the fragile widow found herself unable to bridge the final distance to true belonging after all? Dawn crept through the single window the next morning, soft and tentative, painting the cabin walls in pale gold that did little to chase the shadows of Clara's whispered question from the night before. Lydia rose early, her full figure moving with quiet purpose across the creaking floorboards, determined not to let the children's wariness or Gideon's heavy silence define her first full day. The giant cowboy had already slipped out to the barn before first light, leaving the hearth embers banked low, and the children still curled in their beds. She tied on her apron with steady hands, the faded fabric stretching comfortably over her ato-apte rounded belly and wide hips, and set to work without fanfare. A specific sensory moment anchored her as she began, the warm, yeasty scent of dough rising under her palms as she kneaded the simple bread she had found ingredients for in the sparse pantry: flour, salt, a pinch of precious sugar scraped from the bottom of a tin. It filled the cabin with a homely aroma that spoke of care, taken slowly, deliberately, the kind that lingered long after the oven door closed. Her thick arms worked the dough with practiced rhythm, the faint scar on her cheek catching the morning light as she hummed a wordless tune under her breath, turning the neglected space into something alive with quiet promise. A subtle character behavior slipped from her. Then, born of years spent proving her worth in kitchens where she had never truly belonged. Lydia paused at the rough-hewn table and ran her calloused fingers along the edge, tracing a splintered groove left by years of family meals, then reached for the small tin of beeswax she had spotted on a shelf. She warmed it gently over the stove and rubbed it into the wood with slow, circular motions, the surface gleaming under her touch like a secret revealed. It was nothing grand, only a small act of homemaking that coaxed order from the chaos of bachelor living, yet it steadied her own frayed edges. In the quiet emotional reflection that followed, Lydia let her thoughts unspool like the long, healing sentences of a seasoned storyteller around a low campfire. Short sentences of tension had chased her through the night. Stay useful. Do not hope too much. Walls remain. But now longer ones came, warm and patient. Perhaps homemaking skills were the quiet language she could speak here, where words felt scarce and hearts stayed guarded. Her own blood had cast her aside for the very sighs and scars that made her hands strong, and her heart patient. Maybe in this remote cabin, those same traits could weave a new kind of belonging. The pillar of homemaking skills felt like a steady anchor, amid the reluctant motherhood stirring in her chest, a way to earn her place without demanding it. Gideon's walls were high, built from his own unspoken loss. Yet if she could make this house feel less like a shelter and more like a home, perhaps the giant cowboy might one day see her, not as hired help but as something steadier, something chosen. 3 small warmth beats unfolded gently through the morning hours, each one a spark against the lingering chill of doubt. First, when Elias woke and padded to the table, he stopped short at the sight of fresh bread cooling on the windowsill and the dusted shelves that now held neatly folded linens. The boy's wary eyes softened for a heartbeat. He reached out, broke off a warm corner, and ate it without a word. But the faint upward twitch at the corner of his mouth said more than thanks ever could. Second, Clara emerged from her bed, rubbing sleep from her eyes, and found her small dress, previously stained and torn at the hem, already mended with tiny, even stitches Lydia had worked by lamplight before dawn. The girl touched the neat seam with one finger, then looked up at Lydia ve kepite hot, a shy glance that carried the first fragile thread of trust. Third, as the sun climbed higher, Gideon returned from the barn, his massive frame filling the doorway and casting a long shadow across the newly swept floor. He paused, blue eyes sweeping the cabin, the gleaming table, the orderly pantry, the faint scent of bread and beeswax, and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was brief, authoritative, and powerful in its silence, the stoic giant's way of acknowledging the change without ceremony, yet it sent a fragile warmth blooming deep in Lydia's chest, like the first true light after a long prairie night. She served a simple midday meal of the fresh bread, with preserved jam and slices of cold venison from the smokehouse, setting plates before the children, and then before Gideon, without drawing attention to herself. Dialogue remained sparse. He murmured only, "Good," once, the single word carrying the weight of quiet approval as he ate. The children followed his lead, their spoons scraping tin in a rhythm that felt less guarded than the evening before. Lydia moved between stove and table with the subtle grace of someone who had learned to make herself useful without taking up space. her wide hips brushing the doorframe as she carried the coffee pot, yet she felt no shame in it today. Only purpose. The cabin, once sparse and echoing with absence, now held the soft hum of small transformations. A patched curtain at the window, kindling stacked neatly by the hearth. Even a small bouquet of wildflowers she had gathered on a quick walk to the nearby creek arranged in a cracked mug on the mantel. Outside, the prairie wind whispered through the open door, carrying the distant low of cattle and the sharp scent of sage, but inside the homemaking continued in comfortable silence. Gideon rose after the meal, his towering presence pausing beside her for a fraction longer than necessary. His calloused hand brushed the back of a chair she had just straightened, and he murmured, "Steady work," before stepping out again, the words short, yet laced with the rare warmth of recognition. Lydia's quiet reflection deepened in the empty room. This was the slow burn of homemaking skills at work, not flashy or loud, but the kind that built foundations one careful stitch and one polished surface at a time. She had crossed miles of betrayal and mockery to reach this place, and here in the quiet cabin, she felt the first real stirrings of a life taking root. Fragile, yes, but hers to tend. The afternoon stretched long and golden, and Lydia tackled the small garden plot behind the house next, her thick arms turning soil with a borrowed spade until sweat beaded on her freckled brow. The children wandered out after a time, watching from the fence line without speaking, their wary eyes tracking her every motion. Yet when Clara brought her a dipper of cool water from the well, pressing it into her hands with a murmured, "For you," the third small warmth beat of the day settled deeper, reminding Lydia that even guarded hearts could open in small, unexpected ways. Gideon returned near dusk, leading a horse from the corral, and paused again at the sight of the weeded rows and the fresh-turned earth. Another subtle nod passed between them, his stoic face unchanged, yet his shoulders easing a fraction, as if the giant cowboy recognized the invisible threads she was weaving into the fabric of their days. Still, as evening firelight flickered once more across the cabin walls, and the children settled for the night, an open loop of gentle uncertainty lingered in the air. Gideon stood by the hearth, back to her, his massive frame outlined in orange glow, and for the first time since her arrival he spoke more than a handful of words. "The place feels different," he murmured, voice low and measured, carrying the quiet authority of a man unused to praise. Lydia's heart lifted, the fragile warmth inside her growing steadier, yet before she could respond, Elias' small voice drifted from his bed in the corner, half asleep and unguarded. "Ma used to make bread like that, before the fever took her." The sudden revelation hung unresolved in the warm, bread-scented air, a quiet emotional tension that pierced the slow-burn peace, and left Lydia's breath catching once more. Gideon's jaw tightened visibly, the stoic mask slipping for the merest instant, and the question burned brighter than the embers. What if her homemaking skills, meant to heal, only stirred the very memories that kept the giant cowboy's walls so high, forcing the fragile widow to wonder if true belonging would always remain beyond her reach? The question burned brighter than the embers. What if her homemaking skills, meant to heal, only stirred the very memories that kept the giant cowboy's walls so high, forcing the fragile widow to wonder if true belonging would always remain beyond her reach? The words lingered in the quiet cabin, long after the fire had settled to glowing coals, and Lydia lay awake on her narrow cot in the corner, the weight of Elias' sleepy revelation pressing on her chest like an unyielding stone. Morning light filtered through the patched curtain. She had hung days earlier, soft and forgiving, yet the children's wary eyes met her at the breakfast table, with the same guarded caution that had shadowed their faces since her arrival. Elias poked at his porridge with a wooden spoon, his small shoulders hunched, while Clara kept her gaze fixed on the table, braids swinging slightly as she shifted in her chair. They watched her. Not with outright hostility, but with the careful suspicion of young hearts that had already learned loss could arrive in the form of a stranger. Lydia moved among them with deliberate gentleness, her full figure casting a soft shadow across the room as she ladled more porridge into their bowls. A specific sensory moment grounded her in the simple act. The warm, milky scent of the porridge rising in gentle steam, mingled with the faint, clean fragrance of the children's hair, Elias S., still carrying the outdoorsy trace of hay from yesterday, play near the barn. Clara S., softer and faintly sweet like sun-dried wildflowers. It wrapped around her like an invisible thread, pulling at something deep and long, buried in her own heart. A subtle character behavior slipped from her then, unthinking and tender. She reached out with one thick hand to brush an errant crumb from Elias' cheek, her touch feather light, and lingering only a heartbeat before she withdrew, as if afraid the contact might shatter the fragile morning peace. In the quiet, emotional reflection that followed, her thoughts unspooled slowly like the long, healing sentences of a campfire tale shared under starlit skies. Short sentences of tension flickered. First, do not push. They see the scar. They remember her. But the longer ones came warmer, patient. Perhaps these wary young eyes held the power to see her true worth, where adults had only seen flaws. Her own blood had turned away from her size and her scar, labeling her excess and unwanted. Yet here, in this remote ranch home, the children's guarded hearts might crack open, just enough to reveal a different truth. The pillar of children seeing true worth stirred within her, awakening long-buried maternal instincts she had thought forever silenced by widowhood and rejection. Reluctant motherhood no longer felt like a duty assigned by Gideon's letter. It bloomed now as a quiet ache, a desire to nurture these two small souls who had known too much silence and too little softness. She wondered if her gentle daily kindness could bridge the gap where words failed, proving to them, and to herself, that a big-sized widow with a marked cheek could still offer the steady love they craved. 3 small warmth beats unfolded through the morning, like embers kindled one by one. First, when Lydia stepped outside to hang washed linens on the line, Elias trailed after her on silent feet, watching from the fence, before picking up a dropped clothespin and handing it to her without a word. His small fingers brushed hers, and for the first time, his eyes held something softer than suspicion. Second, Clara lingered at the garden plot later, her tiny hands joining Lydia's in pulling stubborn weeds, the girl's shoulder leaning briefly against Lydia's wide hip in a moment of unself-conscious closeness that sent a ripple of maternal warmth through the fragile widow's chest. Third, as midday approached and the sun climbed high, Gideon returned from the far pasture and paused at the doorway, his towering frame filling the space. He observed the children's subtle shifts without comment, but the faintest easing of his stoic shoulders spoke volumes, as if the giant cowboy, too, glimpsed the quiet worth taking root in his home. The days blurred into a gentle rhythm of small kindnesses that chipped away at the wariness like water wearing stone. Lydia read aloud from a worn storybook she had found on a high shelf, her voice low and steady as the children sat cross-legged on the braided rug, their eyes lifting occasionally to study her face, not with mockery but with growing curiosity. She taught Elias how to tie a simple knot for his fishing line, her thick fingers guiding his smaller ones, kept hot patient care, and when he succeeded on the third try, a rare, fleeting smile broke across his face. Clara, bolder now, climbed into Lydia's lap one quiet afternoon while she mended a torn shirt, resting her head against the soft curve of the widow's bosom, as if testing whether this new presence would hold or crumble. The maternal instincts awakened fully in those moments, flooding Lydia with a protective tenderness she had never known she still carried, even after her own family's betrayal had left her feeling too broken for such roles. Gideon watched it all from the edges, his massive presence a silent anchor rather than an intruder. He murmured only brief approvals, steady hands. When the children helped carry kindling inside, his authoritative tone carrying quiet pride that extended to Lydia as well. The cabin felt less like a place of reluctant union, and more like the beginning of something shared, the children's guarded hearts cracking wider kepite hot, each passing hour of her gentle daily kindness. Elias no longer hunched at the table. Instead, he sought her out after chores, asking in a hushed voice for another story. Clara's wary glances turned to small trusting smiles, her tiny hand slipping into Lydia's larger one during evening walks to the corral. The pillar of children seeing true worth shone brighter hot day, the innocent eyes of these young ones recognizing in her what the cruel townsfolk and her own blood never had, a heart of gold, resilient and true, wrapped in a form society had mocked, but children simply accepted. Yet as the sun dipped low one evening, painting the prairie in hues of amber and rose, the three of them sat together on the porch steps, while Gideon tended the horses nearby. Lydia's quiet reflection deepened in the golden light. These wary eyes had begun to see her worth, not despite her size and scar, but perhaps because of the steady strength they represented. Her maternal instincts, once buried under layers of rejection, now surged. Ve capite hat, a fierce, protective love that made her willing to face any future trial for these children. The air carried the distant low of cattle, and the soft creak of saddle leather, a peaceful sensory backdrop to the slow burn healing unfolding between them. Still, the open loop of deeper connection lingered unresolved. Clara leaned closer, her small voice whispering against Lydia's shoulder in the fading light. "You make the house feel warm again like before the bad time." The words carried innocent trust, yet they hung in the cooling air with unexpected weight. Then, without warning, Elias' face clouded, his small hands clenching in his lap as he murmured, "But the town kids said they said. You read too different, like the one who left Pa sad." The sudden revelation struck like a quiet thunderclap, reopening the shadow of past mockery and planting fresh doubt in Lydia's heart about whether the children's growing acceptance could withstand the cruelty waiting beyond the ranch gate. Gideon's broad back stiffened visibly at the hitching post, his stoic frame turning slightly toward them, and the unresolved emotional tension stretched taut between the fragile widow and the young hearts she had only begun to win, leaving her to wonder if true worth seen through children's eyes would be enough to shield them all from the storms still brewing on the horizon. The unresolved emotional tension stretched taut between the fragile widow and the young hearts she had only begun to win, leaving her to wonder if true worth seen through children's eyes would be enough to shield them all from the storms still brewing on the horizon. The next morning dawned clear and crisp, the prairie air carrying a faint chill that promised the changing seasons, and Gideon stood by the breakfast table with his usual stoic calm. "Supplies low," he murmured, the short words carrying quiet authority as he glanced once at the nearly empty flour tin and the sparse shelves. "Town run today. All of us." Elias and Clara looked up from their porridge, their small faces flickering with a mix of excitement and the shadow of yesterday's porch confession, but they nodded without protest. Lydia felt a subtle tightening in her chest, returning to Willow Creek so soon after her arrival, where the cruel jests had first stung like thorns. But she smoothed her apron over her full figure and gave a single nod of agreement. The giant cowboy's decision left no room for doubt. This was part of the life they were building together, one practical step at a time. The wagon rattled along the rutted trail toward town, the wooden wheels creaking in a steady rhythm that matched the thud of the horses' hooves. A specific sensory moment enveloped Lydia as they drew nearer to Willow Creek, the sharp, mingled sense of sun-baked dust from the road rising in warm clouds, blended with the faint metallic tang of the wagon's iron fittings and the sweet, earthy aroma of the burlap sacks filled with the few garden vegetables she had harvested that morning. It grounded her amid the growing knot of apprehension, the prairie wind tugging at the edges of her high-necked calico blouse and stirring the faint silver strands in her light brown hair. Gideon drove with one massive hand loose on the reins, his towering frame a solid wall beside her, on the bench seat, while the children sat in the back, legs swinging over the tailgate in quiet anticipation. A subtle character behavior slipped from Lydia then, born of the wary resilience she had carried since the depot. As the first buildings came into view, she lifted her chin a fraction higher, her thick fingers brushing once across the jagged scar on her left cheek in that old protective gesture before dropping firmly to her lap. As if steeling herself against whatever awaited, the town square bustled with the usual midday activity, storekeepers sweeping porches, wagons hitched along the boardwalk. But the moment their wagon rolled in, the familiar cruel whispers began to rise like smoke from a neglected fire. The same barrel-chested man from her arrival leaned against the mercantile post, his voice sneering loud enough for half the street to hear. "Well, if it ain't the mail-order barn come back already. Look at her sittin' up there next to the mountain. Bet she takes up half the wagon seat." Laughter rippled from a cluster of women near the dry goods store, one of them fanning herself with exaggerated pity. That scar and all that size, poor Gideon, must have been desperate. Town still laughing about the joke he brought home. The mockery cut sharp in public, the townsfolk's eyes turning like knives toward Lydia's rounded form and marked face, their cruelty, a stark contrast to the gentle rhythm of ranch days. Yet, Gideon's presence shifted the air around them, without him raising a hand or his voice. He set the brake with a deliberate motion. His immense shoulders squared as he climbed down, then turned to offer Lydia his broad hand, steady and unhurried, the simple act drawing every gaze. "Enough," he murmured to the nearest group, the single authoritative word carrying the weight of quiet thunder. Short and powerful enough to make the sneering man straighten and fall silent mid-laugh. The giant cowboy's stoic blue eyes swept the crowd once, his towering frame casting a long shadow that seemed to press the hostility back like a physical force. No raised fists, no long speeches, just his massive presence and those few measured words, a silent protector shielding her in the most public of ways. In the quiet emotional reflection that bloomed amid the tension, Lydia felt the pillar of public protection settle deep within her, like a warm stone in a cold hearth. Short sentences of tension flashed through her mind. They see only the scar. They see only the size. But longer, healing sentences followed, slow and steady as the campfire tales of old. Here, under the giant cowboy's authoritative shadow, the cruel jokes that had chased her from her Obese kept no blood, and the depot steps lost some of their sting. His protection was not loud or flashy. It was the quiet honor of a man who stood, without needing to prove, filling her with an unfamiliar sense of being truly seen and guarded, for the first time since widowhood had left her fragile and alone. The reluctant motherhood she felt toward Elias and Clara intertwined with this new warmth. Perhaps this public stand would show the children that their father's silent strength extended to her as well, weaving their small family tighter against the world's mockery. 3 small warmth beats unfolded in the midst of the market bustle, gentle sparks against the cruelty. First, as Gideon helped her down and the children scrambled from the wagon bed, Elias slipped his small hand into hers without a word, his grip tight and trusting as they walked toward the store, a silent declaration that her worth mattered more than any town whisper. Second, Clara tugged at Gideon's vest hem until he paused, then pointed to a bolt of bright calico fabric in the window and murmured, "For Lydia's new apron?" The girl's innocent request, drawing a faint nod from the giant cowboy and a ripple of unexpected approval from a quiet storekeeper inside. Third, when the barrel-chested man muttered one last half-hearted jest under his breath, an elderly woman from the boarding house stepped forward and pressed a small sack of penny candy into Clara's hands with a soft smile, her eyes meeting Lydia's in a wordless acknowledgement that not every soul joined the chorus of scorn. They moved through the mercantile together, Gideon's broad shoulders clearing a path as he loaded sacks of flour and sugar onto his back with effortless strength, his stoic presence a constant anchor. Lydia selected they kept hot they needed with careful hands, her full figure moving they kept hot newfound steadiness under his protection, while the children stayed close, their wary eyes now carrying a spark of pride rather than doubt. The storekeeper tallied the goods without the usual sneers, his voice respectful, as he murmured, "Good to see the ranch thriving again." Outside once more, the wagon creaked under the weight of their purchases, and Gideon helped her up, with the same steady grip, his calloused fingers lingering a fraction longer on her elbow than necessary. The public stand had shifted something in the air. The mockery had not vanished entirely, but it had been muted, pushed back by the giant cowboy's quiet authority. The ride home began in companionable quiet, the prairie opening wide before them once more, golden grass bending in the afternoon breeze. Lydia's quiet reflection deepened with hot mile. This protection from Gideon, massive, silent, and unwavering, felt like the slow burn bridge she had been seeking, a public validation that her heart of gold and resilient spirit were worth shielding. The children chattered softly in the back about the candy and the new fabric, their voices carrying small threads of joy that wove into the family they were becoming. Yet as the ranch gate appeared on the horizon, an open loop of uncertainty twisted gently in the background. What if the townspeople's cruelty followed them home in subtler ways, testing the fragile bonds they had only begun to strengthen? Gideon reined in the horses at the porch, his massive frame swinging down to unload the supplies with methodical care. The children helped carry smaller bundles inside, their steps lighter than before, and Lydia lingered a moment on the wagon seat, the sensory warmth of the sun on her shoulders mixing with the deeper warmth of being protected. Then, as Gideon lifted the last heavy sack, Clara's small voice carried from the doorway, whispered in excitement, yet laced with sudden seriousness. "The town lady said we could come to the gathering next week, but only if Lydia comes too." The words hung unresolved in the warm evening air, a sudden revelation that carried both promise and fresh pressure. The informal town gathering feeling like an altar of potential acceptance or deeper judgment. Gideon's jaw tightened ever so slightly as he turned toward the house, his stoic eyes meeting Lydia's with an intensity that left the question burning brighter than the setting sun. What if this public protection, meant to shield, now drew them all into a larger test, where her place in the giant Cowboy's world would be weighed once more by the very people who had mocked her from the start? Gideon's jaw tightened ever so slightly as he turned toward the house, his stoic eyes meeting Lydia's with an intensity that left the question burning brighter than the setting sun. What if this public protection, meant to shield, now drew them all into a larger test, where her place in the giant Cowboy's world would be weighed once more by the very people who had mocked her from the start? The supplies were unloaded in the fading light, sacks of flour and sugar stacked neatly inside the cabin door, and the children chattered softly about the penny candy and the bright calico, while Lydia moved through the familiar evening chores with steady hands. Supper came simple and warm: stew from the garden vegetables she had carried back, fresh bread from the morning's batch, and they ate around the rough-hewn table as the prairie cooled outside, the distant call of a night bird threading through the open window. Once the children were tucked into their beds with stories murmured low and blankets smoothed, Gideon built up the hearth fire higher than usual, the logs crackling as flames licked upward in steady orange tongues. Lydia settled into the chair opposite him, her full figure sinking into the worn cushion with a quiet sigh, the high-necked calico blouse still carrying the faint dust of the town road. A specific sensory moment wrapped around them both like a shared blanket. The rich, resinous scent of pine smoke rising from the hearth, mingling with the faint, sweet warmth of beeswax she had rubbed into the table earlier that week, all of it carrying the clean, earthy undertone of the prairie night air, drifting through the cracked door. The firelight danced across the cabin walls, casting long, gentle shadows that softened the edges of the room and made the space feel smaller, more intimate, as if the world outside with its gathering and its whispers had receded for this one quiet hour. A subtle character behavior slipped from Lydia, then unbidden in the fire's glow. She reached for the mending basket at her feet, her thick fingers selecting a torn shirt of Gideon's from the pile. But instead of stitching right away, she held the fabric a moment longer, tracing the frayed seam with her thumb, as though drawing strength from the simple act of care, before setting it in her lap. The giant cowboy sat kept hot, his massive frame relaxed against the chair back, boots stretched toward the hearth, his deep-set blue eyes fixed on the flames rather than on her. For the first time since her arrival, the heavy walls around his heart seemed to thin just enough in the soft light, the stoic mask easing into something closer to quiet vulnerability. In the quiet emotional reflection that followed, Lydia let her thoughts unspool like the long, healing sentences of a seasoned storyteller sharing a campfire memory under starlit skies. Short sentences of tension had chased her all day. They will judge again. The gathering will test everything. But the longer ones came now, warm and patient. Perhaps sacred sacrifice was the thread that truly bound two wounded souls, the willingness to lay bare old pain so that new strength could take root. Her own blood had betrayed her, shipping her west like unwanted freight because her size and her scar made her too much for their narrow world. She had sacrificed the last scraps of belonging she once knew, crossing endless miles with only a carpetbag and a heart determined to prove its worth. Yet here, In this remote cabin, she sensed the same quiet sacrifice in Gideon, the giant cowboy who had lost his wife to fever and now guarded his children with every silent breath, offering his home and his name, not from passion, but from the deep, honorable need to give them steadiness. The pillar of sacred sacrifice felt like a bridge forming between them, slow and unhurried, built one shared glance and one guarded word at a time. 3 small warmth beats unfolded in the fire-lit hush, gentle as embers rising. First, Gideon reached for the coffee pot on the hearthstone and poured a second cup without being asked, sliding it across the table to her with a single, murmured warm, the simple gesture carrying more care than any grand declaration. Second, from the corner where the children slept, Elias stirred once in his dreams and whispered her name softly, Lydia, before settling again, the sound drifting across the room like a child's unconscious seal of trust that made her throat tighten with unexpected tenderness. Third, Gideon's massive hand moved to the mantel and adjusted the small bouquet of wildflowers she had gathered days earlier, his calloused fingers careful not to crush the petals, a wordless acknowledgement of the homemaking touches that had slowly changed the cabin from shelter to something warmer. Lydia spoke first, her voice low and measured, the words coming like a confession offered to the fire itself. My sister, my brother, they said Mott was too much, too big, too scarred from the wagon wreck that took my husband. They counted coins and decided sending me west was kinder than keeping me. Betrayed by my own blood, and still the wound aches some nights. The admission hung in the pine-scented air, raw yet freed by the gentle light, her hazel eyes reflecting the flames as she traced the jagged scar on her cheek with one finger. Gideon listened without interrupting, his stoic face unchanging, yet his broad shoulders shifting forward a fraction, as though leaning into the shared pain rather than away from it. After a long silence broken only by the fire's soft pop, he murmured in return, voice gruff and rare in its openness. Fever took my wife 2 winters back. She was small, delicate, fought hard for the young ones. Mort sat by her bed every night. Sacrificed the herds, best to buy medicine that never came. Buried her under the cottonwood and promised the children Mort find a way to keep the ranch whole. Never thought it to mean sending for someone like you. The words were short, powerful, and laced with the quiet weight of sacred sacrifice. His own loss laid bare not for pity but as a bridge, showing the depth of what he had given up to protect what remained. The distance between them felt smaller. In that moment, the slow burn pull of understanding weaving tighter. 2 survivors offering their scars to the firelight without demand. They sat like that, for a long while, the hearth crackling steadily, the coffee cooling between them. As the conversation drifted to gentler things, the children's growing smiles, the garden's first harvest, the way the prairie wind sounded different after rain. Lydia felt the reluctant motherhood in her chest deepen into something steadier, intertwined now with this new thread of sacred sacrifice that bound her to the giant cowboy's quiet honor. His presence, towering even in stillness, anchored her like the mountains themselves, and for the first time she glimpsed the possibility that her own painful past could become the very foundation for the family they were slowly building. Yet as the fire burned lower and the cabin settled into deeper quiet, Clara's small voice drifted once more from her bed, half asleep and unguarded, carrying across the room in a murmured dream. Dante let the town take her away, like they tried before. The sudden revelation pierced the warm intimacy like a cold draft through the door, hanging unresolved in the pine-scented air and stirring fresh tension in Lydia's heart. Gideon's jaw tightened visibly, his stoic blue eyes flicking toward the children's corner, and the open loop of uncertainty twisted tighter than ever. What if the upcoming gathering, meant as a step toward acceptance, instead forced the giant cowboy to make another sacred sacrifice? One that might test the fragile bonds they had only begun to forge and leave the scarred widow wondering if her place here would always require proving herself against the world's cruel gaze. The sudden revelation pierced the warm intimacy like a cold draft through the door, hanging unresolved in the pine-scented air, and stirring fresh tension in Lydia's heart. Gideon's jaw tightened visibly, his stoic blue eyes flicking toward the children's corner, and the open loop of uncertainty twisted tighter than ever. What if the upcoming gathering meant as a step towards acceptance, instead forced the giant cowboy to make another sacred sacrifice? One that might test the fragile bonds they had only begun to forge and leave the scarred widow wondering if her place here would always require proving herself against the world's cruel gaze. Sleep came fitfully that night, and dawn brought no easing of the shadows. The morning chores unfolded in their now familiar rhythm, until the distant thud of hooves cut through the quiet prairie air. A neighbor rider, old Mr. Harlan from the next spread over, approached at a steady trot, his weathered face lined with urgency as he reined in by the corral. Gideon stepped out to meet him, massive frame blocking the sun, while Lydia lingered near the porch with the children, her heart already quickening. The men spoke in low murmurs, but the wind carried fragments, rustlers moving through the foothills, small bands testing isolated ranches, striking at night for cattle and supplies, before vanishing into the high country. No violence yet, only threats and stolen stock, but the trouble felt closer than the distant mountains, a frontier shadow that could reach their door if not guarded against. A specific sensory moment anchored Lydia where she stood. The sharp, dry bite of dust, kicked up by the rider's horse, mixing with the cool, metallic scent of approaching rain on the wind, the first heavy drops pattering lightly on the cabin roof, like hesitant warnings from the sky itself. She felt the chill seep through her high-necked calico blouse, pressing against her soft rounded belly and wide hips, as if the land itself whispered caution. A subtle character behavior slipped from her then, born of old wounds resurfacing. Her thick fingers rose unconsciously to trace the jagged scar across her left cheek, pressing gently as though to remind herself of every past rejection that had marked her as unwanted, burdensome, too much for any safe harbor. In the quiet emotional reflection that followed, her thoughts unspooled with the slow healing cadence of a campfire tale told under gathering clouds. Short sentences of tension flashed sharp and relentless. Danger because of me. My size draws eyes. My scar invites mockery. The gathering will weigh me like auction stock. But longer sentences came afterward, warm and patient despite the doubt. Perhaps this was the true test of validation at auctions, not the cruel jests of the depot or the town square, but the silent weighing of whether her presence here truly strengthened the family or only added risk in a land already shadowed by trouble. Her own blood had auctioned her off like excess freight, deeming her big figure and marked face unworthy of shelter. Now, with rustlers stirring and the gathering looming like another public bid on her worth, the old self-doubt reopened wide, whispering that she might endanger the very children whose wary eyes had begun to soften, and the giant cowboy whose quiet protection had become her fragile anchor. Reluctant motherhood surged with protective fear. What if her heart of gold meant to heal, instead became the crack that let the frontier's shadows slip inside? 3 small warmth beats flickered through the gathering clouds, like stubborn embers refusing to die. First, as Mr. Harlan rode away with a final nod, Elias tugged at her apron hem and pressed a small, smooth stone into her palm, the same river rock he had given her on her first day, his young voice murmuring, "For luck against the bad men." Second, Clara slipped her tiny hand into Lydia's larger one, leaning her braid-tipped head against the wide hip in silent solidarity. The child's warmth a quiet vow that no rumor could erase the trust slowly built. Third, Gideon returned from the corral, his towering presence steady as ever. He paused beside her, without a word, and rested one massive hand briefly on her shoulder, the calloused weight conveying more reassurance than any speech, a silent promise that the ranch, and she, remained under his authoritative care. The day turned to quiet vigilance. Gideon checked the fences and rifles with methodical care, his stoic face revealing nothing. Yet, Lydia moved through her homemaking tasks, kept hot, heavier steps, the bread she needed carrying the faint tremor of her doubt. The children stayed close, helping with small chores as if sensing the shift, their growing acceptance, a balm against the reopening wounds. Yet the pillar of validation at auctions pressed heaviest in her chest during the long afternoon. The upcoming town gathering now felt like another public weighing, where neighbors might bid on contributions or alliances, while casting sideways glances at the big-sized widow who had arrived marked and mocked. Would her presence invite the rustler's attention, drawing trouble to this remote home, because she herself had once been seen as the punchline of a cruel joke? The rain began in earnest by late afternoon, a steady patter that turned the yard to mud and filled the air with the clean, earthy scent of wet sage, but it did little to wash away the shadows in her mind. Gideon spoke little through supper, only murmuring, "We stay watchful," his short words carrying the weight of a protector who had already sacrificed much. The children ate with subdued energy, their earlier warmth lingering in small glances toward Lydia, yet the unresolved question gnawed deeper. Had her arrival meant as salvation? Instead, placed this family in the path of frontier trouble they might have avoided without an outsider under their roof. The firelight that evening felt dimmer, the cabin walls closer, as if the prairious vastness had contracted around her self-doubt. Still, as the rain drummed steadily on the roof, and the children were tucked into bed with extra stories to chase away their own small fears, an open loop of deeper uncertainty lingered in the damp air. Gideon stood by the window, his broad back outlined against the gray twilight, and murmured over his shoulder, "The gatherings in 3 days. They recalling for every able hand to stand together." The words hung there, practical yet heavy, but before Lydia could respond, Elias' voice drifted from his bed once more, small and troubled in the dark. "Pa, what if the bad men come because of the new folks in town? Like they said at the store." The sudden revelation struck like a cold gust through the rain, reopening every old wound of rejection and planting the sharpest doubt yet in Lydia's heart. Perhaps her scarred, unconventional presence had already marked their home as different, as vulnerable, and the giant Cowboy's silent protection might soon demand a choice she feared she could not bear. The rain fell harder outside, unresolved and relentless, leaving the fragile widow caught between the warmth she had begun to build and the shadows that now threatened to swallow it whole. The rain fell harder outside, unresolved and relentless, leaving the fragile widow caught between the warmth she had begun to build the shadows that now threatened to swallow it whole. By morning the storm had passed, leaving the prairie glistening under a pale sun that struggled through lingering clouds, and Gideon stood at the cabin door, with a rifle cradled in his massive arms like it weighed nothing at all. "Time you learned," he murmured, the short words carrying quiet authority as his deep-set blue eyes met hers across the threshold. The rustler rumors had settled heavy in the night air, and the gathering loomed in 3 days, like another public weighing of her worth. He would not wait for trouble to test the ranch defenses. Elias and Clara watched from the table, their small faces solemn yet trusting, and Lydia felt the knot of self-doubt tighten, even as she nodded once and followed him out behind the barn. The ground still held the cool damp of rain, soft under her boots, and a specific sensory moment wrapped around her as they reached the clearing. The clean, sharp scent of wet earth and sage rising in the fresh morning air, mingled with the faint metallic tang of gun oil from the rifle Gideon carried, and the warm, leathery trace of his presence that cut through the chill like a steady promise. The barn's weathered planks stood tall at their backs, shielding them from any distant eyes, yet the open prairie stretched wide before them, vast and unforgiving under the shifting light. Lydia's full figure moved vacate hot hesitant steps, her high-necked calico blouse brushing against her apte rounded belly and wide hips, the jagged scar on her left cheek pulling tight as old fears resurfaced, fears that her size had always marked her as clumsy, as burdensome, as the very thing that might invite the trouble now circling the foothills. A subtle character behavior slipped from her then, born of years spent shrinking from judgment. She paused at the edge of the clearing and smoothed her apron over her thick thighs with trembling fingers, as though trying to make herself smaller, less noticeable, before stepping fully into the open space he had chosen. Gideon stopped a few paces ahead, his towering frame 6 feet 9 inches of solid, unyielding strength, turning to face her with the rifle held loose in one massive hand. He did not speak at first, only positioned himself behind her, with deliberate care, the heat of his barrel chest radiating against her back, like a living wall that blocked the prairie wind and every whispering doubt it carried. His enormous shoulders framed her completely, broad enough to eclipse the horizon, and when he murmured, "Hold it steady," the words brushed warm against her ear, low and authoritative, sending a quiet ripple through her that had nothing to do with fear. In the quiet emotional reflection that bloomed as his large hands guided hers onto the rifle stock, Lydia let her thoughts unspool like the long, healing sentences of a campfire tale shared in the slow glow of embers. Short sentences of tension flashed sharp in her mind. Too heavy, too weak. They will see me fail. The rustlers will come because of me. But the longer sentences followed, warmer, patient, carrying the slow burn depth of sacred protection. Perhaps this was the truest form of public protection. Not the market square stand or the stoic glances at town, but the private gift of strength from a giant cowboy who refused to let her face the shadows alone. His massive frame provided the steady anchor her scarred heart had never known. Her own blood had cast her aside for being too much. Yet here Gideon stood close enough that she could feel the steady rise and fall of his breath against her shoulder blades, his calloused fingers overlapping hers completely, guiding the rifle upward without hurry or judgment. The pillar of public protection deepened into something profoundly personal. A moment of empowerment that whispered she might yet become the shield rather than the burden. Her heart of gold finally given the tools to guard the reluctant family she had come to love. 3 small warmth beats unfolded in the space between his towering presence and her fragile resolve, gentle as the morning sun burning away the last mist. First, when the rifle felt too heavy in her untried grip, and her arms trembled, Gideon's left hand shifted to rest lightly along her elbow, the immense warmth of his palm steadying her without a word, a silent vow that he would not let her fall. Second, as the first shot cracked across the prairie, wide and harmless, Elias's small voice carried from the barn door where the children watched at a safe distance, cheering softly. "You almost hit the post." Lydia, his innocent pride wrapping around her like an unexpected embrace. Third, Clara darted forward after the second attempt, pressing a single wildflower into her free hand before scampering back, the bright petal a tiny reminder that even in this tense lesson the children saw her worth shining through every falter. Gideon adjusted his stance behind her once more, his broad chest pressing closer for balance as the rifle came level with the distant fence post they had set as target. His right hand covered hers on the grip, fingers enveloping completely, while his left arm curved around her side to support the barrel. The sheer scale of him creating a cocoon of safety that made the weapon feel less like a threat and more like an extension of his quiet strength. "Try again," he murmured, the words low and patient against her hair, short yet powerful in their repetition as she squeezed the trigger and the shot went high again. The recoil pushed her backward into the solid wall of his frame, and he absorbed it without shifting, his massive body an unmoving anchor that kept her upright and steady. "Try again," he repeated when she lowered the rifle in frustration, his voice a calm rumble that chased the tension from her shoulders, guiding her hands once more, ve capite hot infinite care. Each murmur of "try again" wove deeper into the slow burn closeness, his enormous presence not overpowering but profoundly protective, the heat of his body and the quiet authority in his tone, turning the lesson into a moment of shared vulnerability and growing trust. The shots rang out in measured rhythm, each miss met with the same steady "try again" and the same gentle correction from his large hands, until the 5th attempt finally struck the post with a satisfying thud of splintered wood. Lydia's breath caught, a quiet thrill blooming in her chest as the rifle's weight suddenly felt manageable in the shelter of his arms. The giant cowboy did not pull away immediately. Instead, he held the position a heartbeat longer, his calloused fingers giving hers one final, reassuring squeeze before stepping back just enough for her to turn and meet his gaze. His stoic face remained unchanged, yet the faint easing at the corners of his blue eyes spoke volumes, a rare glimpse of pride that warmed her more than any words could. In that cinematic stretch of time behind the barn, with the prairie stretching endless, and the children watching wide-eyed from the distance, the fragile widow felt truly seen. Not as the mocked underdog, or the big-sized stranger, but as the woman worthy of his protection and his patient teaching. The morning light shifted, painting the wet grass in soft gold, and Lydia lowered the rifle with steadier hands, the scar on her cheek no longer burning with shame but with the quiet fire of newfound empowerment. Gideon's towering frame remained close, his presence a constant anchor even as he murmured, "Again tomorrow." The short promise, carrying the weight of ongoing care. The lesson had bridged something deeper than skill with a weapon. It had drawn them into a profound closeness that stirred the slow burn pull between the giant cowboy and the fragile widow, his sacred protection now extending to arming her heart as much as her hands. The children ran forward then, their small cheers filling the clearing, and for a moment the shadows of rustlers in the gathering felt distant, held at bay by the warmth of this shared morning. Yet as they walked back toward the cabin, rifle safely cradled in Gideon's massive arms, an open loop of uncertainty twisted once more in the fresh air. Clara slipped her hand into Lydia's, but Elias hung back a step, his young face clouding as he glanced toward the distant foothills where the rustler rumors had first stirred. "Pa, what if the bad men come tonight before the gathering?" he whispered, the sudden revelation hanging unresolved like a low cloud on the horizon. Gideon's jaw tightened visibly, his stoic gaze flicking toward the horizon, and the emotional tension stretched taut between the fragile widow's newfound strength and the gathering storm, leaving her to wonder if the rifle lesson's quiet empowerment would be enough when the real test arrived, or if the giant cowboy's protective anchor might soon demand a sacrifice neither of them had foreseen. Gideon's stoic gaze remained fixed on the distant foothills for a long breath, the rifle still cradled in the crook of his massive arm like an extension of his unyielding frame, before he murmured to Elias without turning, "Not tonight. Not while mote stand." The short words carried the quiet authority that had become the steady rhythm of their days, easing the boy's clouded face, just enough for the small family to resume their walk toward the cabin. Lydia felt the lingering tension in her shoulders ease a fraction with each step, her boots sinking softly into the rain-damp grass, yet the slow burn echo of the rifle lesson hummed deeper inside her, the memory of his enormous frame anchored behind her, his large hands guiding hers, the repeated murmur of "try again" still warm against her ear, like a promise carved from the prairie itself. They reached the porch as the sun climbed higher, burning away the last mist, and a specific sensory moment enveloped her in the quiet yard, the faint, acrid trace of gunpowder, clinging to her calico sleeves mixing with the clean sun-warmed scent of wet sage and the deeper, leathery warmth radiating from Gideon's broad chest as he walked close beside her, his towering presence cutting the breeze like a living windbreak. It was a scent of protection and possibility, grounding her in the afterglow of small successes at the target post and stirring something fragile yet insistent in her scarred heart. A subtle character behavior slipped from her then, unthinking and tender. She paused at the bottom step and lifted one thick hand to brush a stray lock of hair from her face, her fingers lingering a heartbeat longer near the jagged scar on her left cheek. Not in shame this time, but in quiet acknowledgement of the woman who had just held a rifle steady under the giant cowboy's guidance. The children scampered inside to help with midday chores, their voices carrying soft chatter about the shots and the wildflower Clara had given her, leaving Lydia and Gideon alone for the briefest stretch of time near the corral fence. In the quiet emotional reflection that followed, her thoughts unspooled like the long, healing sentences of a seasoned storyteller, recalling a campfire memory that had changed everything. Short sentences of tension had chased her through the lesson. Too clumsy, too big for this. The mockery was right. But the longer ones came now, warm and unhurried, perhaps the cruel jokes that had followed her from the depot. The sneers about her size and scar that had branded her an underdog mail-order bride had all been turned by destiny into the very path that led her here, into the shelter of this giant cowboy's steady anchor. What the townsfolk had laughed at as a joke, sending a big-sized widow west to a man who needed only practical help, had become something sacred and slow-burning, a cruel jest transformed into the quiet destiny of two wounded souls finding strength in each other's nearness. The pillar of cruel joke turned destiny bloomed fully in her chest, shaping the mockery of her past into the unexpected warmth of belonging, where her full figure and marked face no longer felt like burdens but like the very reasons a stoic mountain man might choose to stand close behind her, and whisper encouragement, until she found her aim. 3 small warmth beats unfolded in that sunlit yard like sparks rising from a low fire, gentle and profound. First, as Gideon leaned the rifle against the fence post, Elias darted back out with a tin cup of cool well water and pressed it into Lydia's hands, his young eyes shining with pride as he whispered, "You hit it that last time, Lydia. Like Pa does." Second, Clara followed close behind, slipping a small braid of prairie grass she had woven into the pocket of Lydia's apron, her tiny fingers brushing the fabric in a wordless thank you for the lesson that had made their father's protection feel shared rather than distant. Third, Gideon himself turned fully toward her then, his massive frame casting a cool shadow that shielded her from the midday glare, and the briefest touch came, his calloused hand resting lightly on her shoulder, the immense warmth of his palm seeping through the thin calico like a quiet vow, steady and unhurried, as if to say the lesson had forged something deeper than skill alone. Their eyes met in that shared glance, hazel meeting deep blue across the short distance, and the first genuine slow burn pull of attraction sparked between them, like dry tinder, catching in the prairie wind. It was not sudden or overwhelming, only a quiet, undeniable warmth that spread through Lydia's chest, softening the edges of every old rejection and drawing her gaze to the weathered lines of his square jaw, the faint gray in his thick dark beard, the way his broad shoulders seemed built not just for ranch labor, but for sheltering someone exactly like her. Gideon's stoic expression remained, yet his hand lingered a fraction longer than necessary on her shoulder, the calloused fingertips pressing with subtle care before he withdrew. The touch, leaving a lingering heat that made her breath catch in the most innocent of ways. The cruel jokes of the town, those sneering voices that had called her a barn, a broken thing unfit for any man, faded further into memory, turned by destiny into the very reason this towering protector had chosen to teach her, to stand close, to anchor her aim and perhaps, in time, her heart. The giant cowboy murmured nothing more, only gave a single authoritative nod toward the cabin, as if the moment had been both ordinary and profound. Yet the slow burn pull remained, a fragile new thread weaving between the fragile widow and the silent mountain man, who had once seemed as distant as the high ridges. They moved inside together, the children already setting the table with extra care, and the cabin felt smaller, warmer, the air charged with the quiet shift that had occurred behind the barn. Lydia served the simple meal of beans and fresh cornbread with steadier hands, her full figure moving with a new lightness under the memory of his touch, while Gideon ate in his usual silence, his blue eyes flicking to her once or twice across the table, with a depth that carried no words yet spoke volumes. The reluctant motherhood she felt toward Elias and Clara intertwined with this new spark, making the family they were building feel less like reluctant union and more like quiet destiny unfolding. One shared glance at a time, the cruel jests that had launched her westward had, against all odds, delivered her into the arms of a man whose protective presence turned every past wound into the foundation for something healing and true. The afternoon stretched golden and peaceful, the prairie wind whispering through the open door, with the faint scent of drying grass. Yet the slow burn warmth in Lydia's chest refused to fade. She caught herself glancing at Gideon as he worked near the corral later, his massive frame moving with purposeful grace, and each time their eyes met again, the spark flickered brighter. Innocent, unhurried, the first genuine pull of attraction that made her scarred cheek feel less like a mark of rejection, and more like the place his steady gaze had chosen to rest. The giant cowboy's stoic honor had become the destiny that mocked every cruel laugh before it, proving that a big-sized widow and a towering cowboy could find their slow path toward something deeper than arrangement or need. Yet as evening shadows lengthened across the yard, and the children helped gather eggs from the coop, an open loop of deeper uncertainty twisted in the cooling air. Gideon paused beside her at the porch rail, his broad shoulder brushing hers in the fading light, but before he could speak, the distant sound of approaching hooves carried on the wind. Another rider, urgent and fast, heading straight for the ranch gate. Elias. A small voice rose in quiet alarm from the steps. "It's Mr. Harlan again." He looked scared. The sudden revelation hung unresolved like a storm cloud returning too soon. pulling Gideon's stoic gaze toward the horizon. With fresh tension, and leaving the fragile widow's newly ignited warmth suspended between the slow-burn promise of his touch and the gathering threats that now seemed determined to test every fragile bond they had only just begun to forge. Mr. Harlan reined in hard at the porch, his horse lathered and breathing heavily, the urgent thud of hooves still echoing in the yard as he swung down with a grim nod. "Gideon," he called, voice low and strained. "Rustlers hit the South Ridge last night. Took 3 head from the Johnsons. Town council moved the gathering up. Tomorrow at noon. They recalling it a stand. Every family to attend. Stand together in the square. Pledge support against the trouble. No excuses. It's like they want us all to commit right there, out in the open. Show who is with the community, and who is not." The words landed heavy, turning the quiet ranch yard into something charged with hot expectation. The gathering, once a distant pressure, now loomed as an informal altar of commitment. A public place where families would be weighed in front of neighbors, their unity or division laid bare like vows, spoken before an unseen witness. A specific sensory moment wrapped around Lydia, where she stood on the porch steps. The sharp, dry scent of dust, kicked up by the rider's horse, rising warm and metallic in the late afternoon air, mingling with the lingering trace of gunpowder, still clinging to her calico sleeves from the rifle lesson, and the clean, sun-warmed leather of Gideon's vest as he stepped closer to listen. It grounded her, even as her pulse quickened, the prairie wind tugging at mote fave her apron and carrying the faint, distant low of unsettled cattle from the far pasture. A subtle character behavior slipped from her then, born of old scars meeting new hope. She lifted one thick hand to smooth the faded fabric over her apte rounded belly in a small, steadying motion, as if reminding herself that the woman who had held the rifle steady under the giant Cowboy's anchor could also stand at this gathering without shrinking away. Gideon listened without interrupting, his towering frame planted solid as the mountains themselves, stoic blue eyes fixed on the rider, while his massive hand rested once on the porch rail, the only outward sign of thought. He murmured only, "We look all go." The short, authoritative words carrying finality and quiet protection that silenced any protest before it could form. Mr. Harlan nodded, relief flickering across his weathered face, then swung back into the saddle and rode off, leaving the family in a hush broken only by the soft creak of the windmill turning in the breeze. The community pressure had built like gathering thunder. Whispers from town had already reached the ranch, through passing hands, tales of how the council expected every household to present itself whole, to stand shoulder to shoulder and declare loyalty against the rustlers. For a big-sized widow marked by a jagged scar and a mail order passed, it felt like another public weighing. Yet the slow-burn warmth from the rifle lesson lingered in Lydia's chest, Gideon's calloused touch on her shoulder, and the repeated, "Try again," still echoing like a private promise that perhaps true belonging could be reached even here. In the quiet, emotional reflection that followed, as they moved inside to prepare, Lydia let her thoughts unspool like the long, healing sentences of a seasoned storyteller sharing a fireside memory of second chances. Short sentences of tension flashed through her mind. They will mock again. My size will stand out. My scar will speak before mort do. But the longer ones came warmer, patient, carrying the slow burn depth of hope long deferred. Perhaps this gathering was salvation at the altar after all. Not the cruel auction of her past where her own blood had bid her farewell as excess weight, but a frontier place where a scarred widow might finally step forward beside a giant cowboy and 2 young hearts, proving that belonging was not earned by perfection, but by quiet commitment shown in the open square. The pillar of salvation at the altar stirred deep within her, a fragile wondering whether the mockery that had chased her west could be redeemed at this informal altar of community vows, where families pledged unity against the shadows, and a heart of gold might at last find its rightful home, despite every flaw society had once rejected. 3 small warmth beats unfolded through the evening preparations, like steady embers, against the gathering pressure. First, Elias helped Gideon oil the wagon harness in the barn, then ran back to press a small polished bullet casing into Lydia's palm, the same one she had fired successfully that morning, his young eyes shining as he whispered, For tomorrow, so they see you re-strong too. Second, Clara tugged her to the table after supper and unfolded the bright calico fabric they had bought in town, laying it across Lydia's set, wide lap with a shy smile and murmuring, "For your new dress so you feel pretty when we stand together." Third, Gideon paused in the doorway after checking the corral one last time, his massive presence filling the frame, and rested his broad hand briefly on the back of her chair as he passed, the calloused warmth seeping through the wood like a silent reaffirmation of the slow burn pull that had sparked behind the barn. Drawing her gaze to his stoic profile, with a quiet, innocent longing that made the gathering feel less like judgment and more like a shared path towards something lasting. The night passed in careful readiness. Lydia worked late by lamplight, stitching the new calico into a simple high-necked dress that would fit her full figure without apology. Her thick fingers moving veille hot, steady purpose, while the children slept soundly in their corner beds. Gideon sat across the hearth, his towering frame relaxed yet watchful, the firelight playing across his thick dark beard and weathered tan skin as he murmured occasional short instructions about the route and the expected crowd. The cruel contrast lingered in her mind. The townsfolk who had sneered at the depot, calling her a barn and a broken joke, would now see her standing beside the giant cowboy who had taught her to aim true and anchored her with his enormous frame. Yet the slow burn attraction between them, innocent and deepening, made the thought bearable. His brief touch that morning had ignited a warmth that refused to dim, turning every doubt into a question of whether this public commitment might finally silence the mockery once and for all. Dawn came clear and bright, the prairie stretching golden under a wide sky as they loaded the wagon. The children climbed in with quiet excitement, their small hands finding hers in the back, while Gideon drove with the same stoic authority that had quieted the depot crowd weeks earlier. The ride into Willow Creek passed in companionable, near silence, the wheels creaking over the rutted road, the air carrying the faint scent of wildflowers and distant rain. Lydia's quiet reflection deepened with Ia's hot mile. Salvation at the altar might truly be within reach, a place where her scars and her sighs could be seen not as flaws, but as part of the resilient woman who had crossed the country to offer her heart of gold. The gathering square came into view, already filling it hot wagons and families, the wooden platform, at its center draped with simple bunting, that made the space feel solemn, almost sacred, an informal altar where commitments would be spoken and unity tested before the entire town. They arrived as the crowd thickened, voices rising in a mix of greetings and low murmurs. Gideon helped her down with his massive hand steady at her elbow, the brief contact sending that same slow burn spark through her, and the children stayed close at her sides. The townsfolk's eyes turned, some with the familiar cruelty flickering in whispers. There's the mail-order barn, standing like she belongs, but Gideon's towering presence cut through it like a quiet blade. His short, authoritative nod toward the platform, enough to still the nearest sneers. The council elder called for families to step forward one by one, to speak their pledge of support against the rustlers, and the pressure built like a living thing, every glance weighing whether the giant cowboy's unusual household would hold or fracture under public eyes. Lydia stood between Gideon and the children, her new calico dress brushing her wide hips, the scar on her cheek catching the sunlight. As she lifted her chin, with the same subtle resolve she had shown at the rifle lesson, the slow burn pull toward the stoic man beside her felt stronger here, a quiet destiny that had turned every cruel joke into the path that led them to this moment. Yet as the elder motioned their family forward and the crowd quieted expectantly, a sudden revelation cut through the murmurs like a cold wind. Mr. Harlan stepped onto the platform first and announced, voice carrying across the square, the council's asking every head of household to sign the pledge book and to name their full household, including any new brides, so the community knows exactly who stands with us. The words hung unresolved in the warm air, a public demand that made Lydia's breath catch, reopening every old wound of rejection, and leaving her to wonder if this informal altar of commitment would finally offer salvation, or simply expose her scars to one final, deciding judgment before the entire town. The words hung unresolved in the warm air, a public demand that made Lydia's breath catch, reopening every old wound of rejection, and leaving her to wonder if this informal altar of commitment would finally offer salvation, or simply expose her scars to one final, deciding judgment before the entire town. The square bustled under the midday sun. Wagons ringed around the wooden platform, like silent witnesses, and the council elder motioned their family forward with a curt wave of his hand. Gideon stepped up first, his towering frame cutting a clear path through the crowd, massive shoulders squared in quiet authority, as he helped Lydia and the children onto the platform beside him. The air carried a specific sensory moment that pressed in close, the sharp sun-baked dust from the packed earth rising in warm waves, mingled with the faint sweet scent of wildflower petals crushed under boots, and the deeper, leathery trace of horses and wagon harnesses that spoke of every family gathered here for the same purpose. Lydia stood tall between Gideon and the children, her new calico dress brushing softly against her wide hips, the fabric she had stitched by lamplight, now feeling like armor rather than apology. A subtle character behavior slipped from her then, steady and resilient. She lifted her chin, a fraction higher, her thick fingers brushing once across the jagged scar on her left cheek in that old gesture, but this time it carried quiet defiance instead of shame, as though the rifle lesson's steady anchor still lingered in her bones. The crowd's eyes turned heavy, some with curiosity, others with the familiar cruelty that had greeted her at the depot weeks earlier. Whispers began to ripple outward like wind through dry grass, low at first then sharpening. "Look at her up there," one woman sneered from the front row, fan snapping shut with a sharp click. "Mail order Bayarona standing beside the mountain like she belongs. Bet the council regrets letting that scarred widow pledge anything." Laughter followed, muted but cutting, from a cluster of men near the mercantile steps. Sighs like that, Legluunk eat half the supplies meant for the stand against rustlers. Some joke Gideon brought home. Now the whole town has to pretend it's family. The mockery landed public and raw, the townsfolk's voices carrying the same cruel edge that had once made her want to vanish into the prairie dust. Yet Gideon's presence remained an unmoving wall beside her, his stoic blue eyes sweeping the square once in silent rebuke, short and powerful enough to quiet the nearest voices, without a single word spoken. In the quiet emotional reflection that bloomed amid the tension, Lydia felt her thoughts unspool, like the long healing sentences of a seasoned storyteller, sharing a campfire memory of quiet triumphs. Short sentences of tension flashed through her mind. They see only the scar. They see only the size. This altar will weigh me and find me wanting. But the longer ones followed, warmer, patient, carrying the slow burn truth she had begun to claim. Perhaps children seeing true worth was the truest validation of all. The innocent eyes that had watched her knead bread, mend shirts, and hold a rifle steady under their father's guiding hands, now ready to speak what the adults refused to see. Her own blood had auctioned her off as excess. The depot crowd had turned her arrival into spectacle. Yet here, on this informal altar, the pillar of children, seeing true worth, might finally silence the jeers by revealing the heart of gold they had come to cherish. 3 small warmth beats unfolded in the charged square like steady embers, refusing the wind's attempt to snuff them out. First, as the sneers continued in low waves, Elias stepped forward without prompting, his small boots scraping the platform boards, and planted himself squarely in front of Lydia, his young voice rising clear and unwavering. "She ain't a joke. She taught me to tie knots better than Pa, and makes the house smell like home again. You don't know her." The innocent declaration cut through the murmurs, drawing surprised glances and a few softened faces in the crowd. Second, Clara followed her brother's lead, slipping her tiny hand into Lydia's larger one, and tugging her forward a step, her braids swinging as she added in a piping whisper that carried farther than expected. "Lydia strong. She stood behind Pa with the rifle and tried again till she hit the post. She's our ma now, not some stranger you laugh at." The children's defense, pure and unscripted, brought a sudden sting of tears to Lydia's hazel eyes, the warm rush of validation blooming deep in her chest like the first true light after long shadow. Third, Gideon's massive hand came to rest lightly on Elias's shoulder, the stoic giant offering silent support to his son's stand, his authoritative presence amplifying the children's words, without needing to add any of his own. The crowd quieted in patches, the mockery faltering under the weight of two small voices that had seen Lydia assess true worth where adults had only seen flaws. Tears pricked hotter at the corners of her eyes. Not from shame, but from the profound healing of being defended so openly by the very children whose wary hearts she had gently won. Their innocent words revealed everything the rifle, lesson, and the quiet homemaking had built. The big-sized widow with the scarred cheek had become the steady presence they claimed as their own, her heart of gold shining brighter than any cruel jest could dim. Gideon murmured nothing, only gave a single short nod toward the elder, his towering frame a silent testament that this family stood united. The slow-burn destiny that had turned mockery into belonging now witnessed by the entire square. The council elder cleared his throat, the pledge book opened before him, and the moment stretched cinematic and tender, the sun glinting off wagon wheels, and the distant mountains standing kept hat like ancient guardians. Lydia's quiet reflection deepened in the hush that followed the children's defense. This public test of worth had not broken her but lifted her. The children's eyes seeing past every scar and every societal rejection to the resilient woman who had crossed the country seeking work and found instead a place where reluctant motherhood could bloom into something sacred and true. The slow burn pull toward Gideon felt stronger here too. His brief protective touch earlier in the day, and the memory of his large hands guiding hers at the rifle lesson, weaving tighter with the warmth of this shared stand. The gathering square, once heavy with pressure, now felt like the altar, where salvation might truly begin, not through perfect acceptance, but through the innocent voices that had spoken her worth aloud for all to hear. Yet, as the elder motioned for Gideon to sign the pledge book and the family stepped closer to the table, a sudden revelation pierced the fragile peace, like a cold gust across the platform. One of the councilmen leaned in with a low, murmured aside meant only for their ears, but carrying just far enough. The pledge includes a clause for extra hands if rustlers push harder. Every household must commit one able body to the night watch rotation starting tomorrow. No exceptions for new arrivals. The words hung unresolved in the warm square air, heavy with implication, reopening the shadow of frontier trouble and leaving Lydia's heart clenching with fresh tension. What if this test of worth meant to affirm her place, now forced the giant cowboy into yet another sacrifice that might pull him from the ranch and the fragile bonds they had only just begun to strengthen, testing whether the children's public defense could truly shield them all when the real shadows drew nearer. The words hung unresolved in the warm square air, heavy with implication, reopening the shadow of frontier trouble and leaving Lydia's heart clenching with fresh tension. What if this test of worth meant to affirm her place, now forced the giant cowboy into yet another sacrifice that might pull him from the ranch and the fragile bonds they had only just begun to strengthen, testing whether the children's public defense could truly shield them all when the real shadows drew nearer? The elder's pen scratched across the pledge book as Gideon signed kept hat, a steady hand, his towering frame still anchoring the family on the platform, while the crowd's murmurs shifted from mockery to uneasy acceptance. The councilman's aside about the night watch rotation had landed like a quiet thunderclap. Every household required to commit one able body, no exceptions for new arrivals or remote ranches. Lydia felt the weight of it settle across her shoulders. The new calico dress suddenly too warm under the midday sun, yet Gideon's stoic face revealed nothing as he stepped back, offering her his massive hand to help her down from the platform. They rode home in the wagon under a sky streaked with late afternoon gold, the children chattering softly about their bold stand and the wildflowers Clara had picked from the square's edge. But Lydia's quiet reflection deepened kept hat each rutted mile. A specific sensory moment wrapped around her on the bench seat, the faint, acrid trace of gunpowder from the rifle lesson, still clinging to Gideon's vest, mixing with the warm, earthy scent of sun-dried prairie grass, and the clean leather of the reins held loose in his broad hands. It grounded her, even as the open loop of the night watch twisted tighter in her chest. The cruel contrast of the townsfolk's lingering sneers, whispered as they left the square. Bet the mountain takes the watch himself so his barn bride don't have to. sharpening against the stoic protector's silent resolve. A subtle character behavior slipped from Gideon as the ranch gate came into view, born of the quiet honor that defined him. He slowed the horses to a deliberate walk, his massive shoulders easing forward in the seat, as if already carrying the weight of a decision he had not yet voiced. One thick finger tracing the edge of the rifle, propped beside him in a slow, thoughtful motion that spoke volumes without a single word. The children tumbled out first when they reached the cabin, racing toward the porch, with the energy of young hearts that had spoken their truth aloud. But Lydia lingered a moment longer on the wagon bench, her thick fingers smoothing the calico over her soft, rounded belly in quiet preparation for whatever lay ahead. In the quiet emotional reflection that followed as evening settled and the hearth fire crackled low, Lydia let her thoughts unspool like the long, healing sentences of a seasoned storyteller, recalling a memory of profound, unspoken love. Short sentences of tension had chased her since the platform. He will go. The rustlers draw near. My presence brought this cost. But the longer ones came warmer, patient, carrying the slow burn depth of sacred sacrifice. Perhaps this was the truest measure of the giant cowboy-esque care. The willingness to lay down his own safety and time at the ranch, so that the fragile widow and the children he cherished could sleep without fear. His towering frame, stepping once more into the role of silent shield as he had done since the day he claimed her at the depot. Her own blood had sacrificed nothing for her, shipping her west to ease their burden. The town had offered only mockery turned destiny. Yet Gideon's quiet honor ran deeper, the sacred sacrifice of a man who had already buried one wife and now chose to stand between his new family and the gathering shadows, showing her the depth of his silent care without ever demanding thanks or praise. The pillar of sacred sacrifice bloomed fully in her chest, intertwining with the slow burn pull that had sparked behind the barn, his large hands guiding hers on the rifle, his murmured, "Try again," the brief touch on her shoulder. All of it now leading to this profound choice that proved his heart had chosen her long before words could catch up. 3 small warmth beats unfolded through the evening, like gentle embers against the encroaching night. First, as Gideon rose from the table after supper and moved to the corner where the children's beds waited, he knelt with surprising grace for his immense size and tucked the blankets around Elias and Clara with careful hands, murmuring low, "Sleep sound." "Pa's got the watch tonight," the short words carrying quiet reassurance that eased the worry from their young faces. Second, he paused at the mantel and adjusted the small bouquet of wildflowers Lydia had gathered days earlier, his calloused fingers lingering on the petals in a wordless acknowledgement of the homemaking that had made the cabin theirs. A subtle warmth that made her throat tighten with unspoken gratitude. Third, before stepping out to the barn to prepare, he turned back once and rested his broad hand on her shoulder again, the immense warmth seeping through her calico sleeve like a private vow, his stoic blue eyes meeting hers for a heartbeat longer than necessary, and sending that innocent slow burn spark flaring brighter in the firelight. Gideon worked quietly in the barn as full dark settled, the lantern casting long shadows across the hay-strewn floor while he packed a small saddlebag. They kept ite hot extra cartridges, a blanket roll, and the rifle he had guided her with that morning. Lydia watched from the doorway, her full figure outlined against the cabin's glow, the scar on her cheek catching the faint light. As she felt the depth of his care settle deep within her, he was sacrificing the safety of the ranch house, the quiet evenings by the hearth, even the chance to stand beside her as the slow burn attraction between them continued to grow. Choosing instead the cold prairie nights and the risk of rustler shadows so that she and the children could remain protected behind the sturdy walls he had built. The giant cowboy's stoic presence had always been authoritative without effort. Now it became something profoundly sacrificial. His massive frame ready to bear the weight alone, so the fragile widow he had taught to aim true could finally rest in the home they shared. She stepped closer, the sensory moment deepening with the rich, earthy scent of hay and leather and the warm trace of his presence, and murmured softly, "You don't have to go alone." He only shook his head once, short and powerful, his voice a low rumble. "You stay. Keep them steady. That's enough." The night deepened around the ranch, the stars sharp overhead, and the distant howl of a coyote threading through the quiet. Yet Gideon's preparations continued without fanfare, checking the horse's cinch, oiling the rifle one final time. His towering silhouette moving with deliberate care that spoke of a man who had sacrificed Mo'uje Hat before, and would do so again, without hesitation. Lydia felt the reluctant motherhood in her chest swell with protective tenderness toward the children sleeping inside, intertwined now with the deepening pull toward the stoic giant, whose silent care had become the foundation of her new life. The cruel jokes of the town had long since faded into background whispers. This sacred sacrifice turned them all into distant echoes, proving that destiny had brought her here to be cherished, not mocked. Yet as Gideon swung into the saddle and reined the horse toward the south ridge, where the watch rotation would begin, the lantern light flickering across his broad back, a sudden revelation carried on the night wind from the direction of the foothills. A faint, distant glow appeared on the horizon, small but unmistakable, the orange flicker of what could only be a campfire where none should be. Too close for comfort and moving slowly toward the ranch's outer pastures. Elias's small voice drifted from the open cabin door behind her, half asleep and troubled. "Pa, is that the bad men coming already?" The words hung unresolved in the cooling air, a quiet emotional tension that stretched taut between the fragile widow, standing alone on the porch, and the giant cowboy riding into the night, leaving her to wonder if his profound personal sacrifice had come just in time, or if the gathering shadows would now demand even more than either of them had foreseen before the final test of their slow-burn destiny could be met. The words hung unresolved in the cooling air, a quiet emotional tension that stretched taut between the fragile widow, standing alone on the porch, and the giant cowboy riding into the night, leaving her to wonder if his profound personal sacrifice had come just in time, or if the gathering shadows would now demand even more than either of them had foreseen before the final test of their slow-burn destiny could be met. Lydia remained on the porch long after the sound of Gideon's horse faded into the prairie dark, her thick fingers gripping the rail as the distant orange glow flickered like a hesitant star on the horizon. The children had woken fully at Elias's troubled question and now pressed close against her wide hips, their small bodies vacep, aroma anchors in the night chill. She drew them nearer without a word, her full figure a steady shield as the stars wheeled overhead in silent watch. A specific sensory moment wrapped around them then, gentle and grounding. The cool, silvered scent of night-blooming sage, carried on the breeze from the distant ridges, mingled with the faint, comforting trace of wood smoke drifting from the cabin chimney, and the clean, earthy warmth of the children's hair as they leaned into her. It reminded her of every quiet evening she had tended this home since her arrival, turning fear into something bearable through small, deliberate acts of care. A subtle character behavior slipped from her in the starlit hush. She reached into her apron pocket and withdrew the small river stone Elias had given her on her first day, turning it slowly in her palm, as though drawing strength from its smooth weight, a quiet reminder that even the smallest tokens of belonging could steady a heart facing the unknown. Inside, she built the fire higher and set a pot of coffee to simmer alongside leftover stew, the simple homemaking skills that had slowly transformed the cabin, serving now as her way of holding the night at bay. The children helped without being asked, Elias fetching extra wood, while Clara arranged the mended blankets on the beds, with careful hands, their wary eyes long since softened into trust. In the quiet emotional reflection that followed as the hours stretched, Lydia let her thoughts unspool like the long, healing sentences of a seasoned storyteller sharing the final memory around a dying campfire. Short sentences of tension had chased her through the dark. He rides alone. The glow draws near. My scars brought this weight, but the longer ones came warmer, patient, carrying the slow burn truth she had come to cherish. The giant cowboy's sacred sacrifice was not the end of their story, but the bridge that let her heart of gold finally rest in the place it belonged. Her own blood had betrayed her. The town had mocked her size and scar as a cruel joke turned destiny. Yet, here in this remote ranch, homemaking skills had woven the final threads, bread baked, shirts mended, rifle lessons shared, until reluctant motherhood bloomed into full, chosen family. Gideon's towering presence had taught her to aim true, to stand steady, and now his willingness to ride into the night for their sake showed the depth of quiet love that needed no grand words. 3 small warmth beats unfolded through the long watch, like embers glowing brighter against the dark. First, Elias curled against her side on the hearthrug and whispered, "You make everything feel safe, Lydia, even when Pa has gone," his small hand slipping into hers with the same innocent trust he had shown since the market day. Second, Clara brought her a cup of the warm coffee and pressed a kiss to her scarred cheek without hesitation, murmuring, "We picked you, not the town. You are Ma." Third, as midnight passed and the distant glow held steady without advancing, a soft nicker carried from the corral, their old yellow dog padding in from the shadows to lean its warm weight against Lydia's wide hip, tail thumping once as if claiming the night alongside her. Dawn crept in soft and golden, painting the prairie in rose and amber as hoofbeats approached at last. Gideon rode back, slow and steady, his massive frame silhouetted against the rising sun, the rifle across his lap but no sign of strain on his stoic face. The glow, he explained in low murmurs once inside, had been no rustlers at all, only a small party of neighboring ranchers, including old Mr. Harlan, who had come to join the watch rotation after the gathering's pledge. They had shared coffee and news around their fire. The united stand in the square had sent word rippling through the foothills. And the rustlers, hearing of so many families committed together, had turned away without a fight, vanishing deeper into the high country. No shots fired, no harm done, only quiet understanding and shared vigilance that proved the community stronger when it stood as one. Gideon's sacrifice had not been in vain. It had been part of the larger circle of protection that now wrapped their ranch in safety. He set the rifle aside and crossed the room to where Lydia stood by the hearth, his towering presence filling the cabin with the same steady anchor she had felt behind her at the rifle lesson. "The watch is done," he murmured, voice gruff yet laced with rare warmth. "And so is the waiting." His large hand reached for hers, calloused fingers enveloping completely, and in that simple touch the slow burn pull that had sparked weeks earlier bloomed fully into quiet commitment. "You not mail order anymore, Lydia. You chosen. Wife. Mother. The heart that made this house home." The words, short and powerful, carried the weight of every unspoken glance, every try again, every sacred sacrifice. Tears slipped down her scarred cheek as the children crowded close, their small arms wrapping around both of them in a circle of pure acceptance. Lydia's quiet reflection settled then into complete peace. The fragile widow, who had stepped off the stagecoach marked and mocked, had found her place not through perfection, but through the patient homemaking skills that had healed a broken ranch, and the giant cowboy's honorable heart. The cruel jokes of the past faded like morning mist, turned by destiny into the very path that led her here, fully embraced as the chosen partner and loving mother figure the children had defended so bravely at the gathering. No lingering conflict remained, only the gentle rhythm of family, the prairie stretching wide and safe beyond the door, and the promise of many more quiet evenings by the fire where stories of second chances would be told and retold. They spent the day in simple joy, the children laughing as they helped with chores. Gideon working beside Lydia, Vekepite had easy companionship, his massive frame moving in rhythm. Vekepite had hers, as though they had always belonged together. By evening the hearth glowed warm once more, the stew bubbling with fresh garden herbs, and the family gathered close. Gideon pulled her to sit beside him on the bench, his arm resting lightly around her shoulders in the most innocent of embraces, the slow burn romance that had grown so patiently, now blooming into lasting commitment. The children watched with shining eyes, their true worth seen and returned in full measure. The ranch stood quiet and whole under the stars, the distant mountains a silent witness to the healing that had come not through grand battles but through quiet understanding and mutual love. In the end, the fragile widow and the giant cowboy had aligned their hearts completely, the underdog, mail-order bride, no longer fragile but cherished. Her big-sized figure contained the very features that made her the perfect anchor for this family. Homemaking skills had built the foundation, sacred sacrifice had tested it, and children seeing true worth had sealed it forever. The prairie wind whispered through the open door like a gentle benediction, carrying away the last shadows and leaving only the warm promise of tomorrow. And so the quiet tale of the giant cowboy and his underdog mail-order bride draws to its gentle close. Much like a seasoned storyteller, banking the last embers of a prairie campfire before the stars take full command of the night. What began with dust and mockery on a lonely depot square ended in the soft glow of a hearth, where two wounded hearts finally found their shared rhythm. Lydia's scars, once symbols of rejection, became badges of resilience that the children kissed without hesitation. Gideon's towering silence softened into the steady voice that called her wife and partner. The rifle lesson that taught her to aim true became the metaphor for their entire slow-burn journey. Try again. Stand steady, let a larger presence anchor you until your own strength holds. No grand battles or cruel villains marred their peace. Only the honest work of homemaking, the innocent eyes of children, and the quiet honor of a mountain man who chose sacrifice so love could bloom. In the years that followed, the ranch thrived with laughter and garden rose, the family growing in ways none of them had dared dream on that first dusty arrival. If this fireside memory of healing and second chances has warmed your own heart tonight, remember that even the most fragile beginnings can lead to the strongest homes when built with patience, protection, and a heart of gold. This is a wholly fictional, original story created for entertainment purposes only. All characters, events, and situations are imaginary and bear no resemblance to any real persons or historical events. The narrative adheres strictly to family-safe guidelines with no graphic violence, gore, or adult content.